Hello and welcome to PowerServer 2017 project configuration for both web and mobile applications. For this particular video, I'm using a simple configuration example. In other words, I'm running on Windows 10 64-bit OS, in fact the Fall Creator Edition. I'm using a traditional PowerBuilder 2017 application, no special features like web APIs for example, just straight client server. We're deploying to a .NET-based 64-bit PowerServer. We're utilizing PowerServer Toolkit's configuration tool. We're also using SQL Anywhere 64-bit DBMS. Note, however, that I have both the 32-bit and 64-bit clients installed because the PowerBuilder IDE is 32-bit and PowerServer is 64-bit. We're connecting to SQL Anywhere from PowerBuilder and PowerServer through Open Database connectivity. And we're utilizing a local deployment model, which means PowerBuilder, PowerServer, PowerServer Toolkit, and SQL Anywhere are installed on the same developer PC. So what is a PowerServer project configuration? Well, if we look at the PowerBuilder IDE, we'll see that in normal Win32, Win64 applications, we actually build a project object. That project object tells PowerBuilder how to deploy your particular PowerBuilder application. It also includes resources for that particular project or application executable as well. If we look at the PowerServer Toolkit, which is now installed inside the PowerBuilder Universal IDE, it also has a configuration tool. That configuration tool acts just like the project object in the PowerBuilder IDE. It basically points to the PowerBuilder application, how you would like it deployed, and what resources you'll need in both the web and or mobile environment when you deploy it. So PowerServer configuration. First of all, we need to launch the PowerBuilder IDE. This must be the Universal Edition because it includes the PowerServer Toolkit. Once you actually launch PowerBuilder, you'll see the PowerServer Toolkit will be a secondary toolbar right underneath the main PowerBuilder toolbar. The first tool that we're going to use is the Configuration Wizard. That'll build us a PowerServer project which will map to our existing PowerBuilder application and define exactly how we'd like to deploy it. Once we start the PowerServer Toolkit configuration, we'll go through the wizard and it'll ask us questions such as what is our target, what PowerBuilder libraries do we want, how do we want to deploy it, how do we connect to the database, and other external resources such as images, OCX files, DLLs, INI, etc. Once it has all that information, it'll actually communicate to PowerServer and deploy all those components ready for either a web execution or a mobile execution. So let's have a look at doing that now in a real case scenario. So returning back to the PowerBuilder 2017 Universal IDE, we can see here along the lower secondary toolbar the PowerServer Toolkit. The first icon that we need to use or tool is the configuration guide. You'll see here that we actually have the sales demo application that comes with the PowerBuilder Universal or PowerServer 2017 installation. If we were to actually execute that, you'll see that we come to a login screen. After the login screen, for example, we can look at orders, we can look at different graphs. We can actually go to customers and look at the detail of a particular customer. You'll notice that I'm interacting here with the actual controls on the window, the toolbars, and the pull-down menus along the top. This is a standard Win32, Win64 executable client-server application. So we'd like to webify or mobilize this application. How do we do that? So the first thing we need to do is we need to go to the PowerServer Toolkit, use the Configuration Guide wizard. So click on the first icon. You'll notice here that the wizard comes up and it's going to ask you a set of questions. As it goes through each question, you'll see a green dot appear beside the actual section where you've provided a successful answer. So let's do that now for the sales application. So I'm going to select Next. We can give it a name. So again, I'm just going to call this Sales. We can define the type of project. It's either web or mobile, or it can do both. I'm going to select both here because I'd like this application to run on mobile devices as well as the web browser. So again, here's the name when you actually execute it, Sales. We can select the Browse button here and we can select an icon and we can give it a description. For example, Sales Demo App. And if it's on a mobile device, we can even change the background. For example, maybe I'd like a nice light blue or something like that. So I can select that. This will be the background only for the mobile application, but not in the web. And now I'll select Next. The next thing it wants to know, of course, is the target, because the target has the PowerBuilder library list. So if I select the ... here, so you can see here we do have a target. I'm just going to highlight that and hit Open. And now I don't have to fill in the PowerBuilder library list. I don't even have to tell it which particular version of PowerBuilder I'm using. It picks it up from the target information itself. And now I'll select Next. Now for the local deployment, deploy to both PowerServer and a local web server. So if I hit the Edit button here for the web server, you can see that we're actually using Microsoft IIS. It just wants to know, for example, what is the IP address or the DNS name and what port that particular IIS is actually listening on, and where the actual root folder is, so it can actually deploy the application. So once you've filled in this particular information, and you only have to do that once, every time you do another configuration, you can just use this information. But you can see here we can hit the test web server settings, and it comes back and says, yes, IIS is listening okay and ready to go. You'll notice also for PowerServer itself, we have the same ability here. We can actually define the PowerServer, whether it's a .NET version of PowerServer or a Java Enterprise Edition. What's the actual DNS or IP address, the port that it's listening on, for example. And whether we want to connect to it using HTTP or HTTP secure protocol. Again, once you've filled in the information, and you only have to do this once, we can hit the test here to make sure that PowerServer is also listening correctly. Everything looks good. So I can leave these entities checked at this point. We verify that they do exist and they are listening okay. So we're ready to do the deployment step once we finish answering all the questions. Select Next. Now, what type of database would you like to use? So for the sales demo application, it uses SQL Anywhere, so I can check that. But notice that we can use a plethora of different database management systems. So you have to define which one you're actually going to connect to. If you don't see it here, you can select the Edit, and you can go here and define your own. For example, in the Appeon example sample database, we can actually fill in, for example, the user ID and the password, SQL, and then we can test to make sure that that's okay. And you can see here that that database is there, and we can actually connect to it. It's just emulating what PowerServer would be doing on behalf of the web or mobile application. If you want, you can actually add a new one as well if you don't see the database that you actually want to connect to. So you could select the database itself and then provide the necessary connection information. So we know this one is working fine. So I can basically hit the Next button here. Notice it's testing the connection, and then it moves on. Now, to actually connect to the database, you're going to use a transaction object. Typically, most applications default to the one that's built into the application object, which is the SQL Communications Area, or SQL-CA for short. I'm going to hit the Add button here. Notice that it defaults to SQL-CA. I can look at PowerServer, and I can see which databases are defined to PowerServer. I'm going to use Appeon sample database, so I'll just highlight that. So once I've actually selected a database that PowerServer can connect to, I can actually then define the fact that it's actually a SQL Anywhere database, SAP SA. If you don't see the database that you want, you can actually hit the Add button here and add it yourself. For example, we could create a database here called Sales. It's connecting using the SQL Anywhere database driver. Of course, the user ID will be DBA, password will be SQL. The default, of course, is connection pooling is on. You can turn that off. And if you want, instead of PowerServer doing the actual physical connect, you can turn on dynamic database connection and let your application do the physical connect versus a logical connect. Dynamic database connection, of course, is a slight degradation to performance because you're not being able to use the database connection thread pooling. So we suggest that you leave that off, but leave pooling on. Now we're actually going to define, for example, ODBC. We're going to define the database that we'd like to connect to, and then we'll hit Test. Notice at this point, once we've done all the testing, it's added to the list here. I can select Sales, and notice now that we've actually mapped our own database through PowerServer. So even though the mapping wasn't there, and we could have used the Appeon Enterprise Manager console to PowerServer to do this, but we can do that here in the actual configuration wizard as well to save us time, instead of going back and forth between the two tools. I'm going to hit OK at this point. So now we have a transaction object, SQL-CA. Note that your PowerBuilder applications both web and mobile, could connect to more than one database at a time, or more than one database management system. Therefore, you may have more than one transaction object, so you can repeat the add process for as many transaction objects as the PowerServer application uses currently in the native Win32 or 164 environments. I only have one, so I'll hit Next. The next thing it's going to do is ask you where the image files are located. Typically, based on the target, it knows where the actual image files are in that folder. I like to hit Include Subfolders and let it search all the subfolders as well to make sure it can find all the images, and then select Next. In the next step of the configuration wizard, it'll be asking you if there are any initialization files that you use within your application. If I select Add File here, it'll give me a list of INI files that are in the application folder for that application. In this case, the sales application doesn't use any, so I don't have to map that. Then select Next. The other thing you may want to do is add external files. Add DLLs or OCXs. We can add text files or images that are outside the application work area. In this case, we don't have any external files to add, otherwise I could select them here. So I'm just going to leave that empty and select Next. The wizard now confirms all the answers that you've given to all the questions throughout the sections that are now green, indicating that we've made an answer to all those particular areas. Now we can actually hit the Finish button, and the configuration wizard in PowerServer 2017 is going to begin the deployment. The deployment itself may take a while, depending on the speed of your processor and the overall performance of your PC. Once the actual deployment has been done, the configuration wizard will come back and give you an analysis of what actually went on. The nice thing we can see here that there are no errors or no warnings. However, we still may have a little bit of work to do. Select the analysis report and check to make sure that if there are unsupported items, they will be listed here, and if you click on them, the unsupported feature analysis report will give you some indication as to the severity of the unsupported item and what you can do to actually fix it. So you may have to go back and tweak your source code a little bit and then redeploy it again here to clean all the unsupported items up. At this point, the application doesn't have any, so I can continue on. So we're going to test that in the web browser. You notice here that I have a Run button, and it's going to actually execute that in the Internet Explorer browser. So I'm going to select Run at this point. Notice within the browser we have now the login screen. I can hit the login button to use the user ID and password default. I can click on customers, and you can see here that we can deal with the customer data. Or we can click on order types, for example, see those particular graphs again, the pie chart, the bar graph, or 3D column, for example. So you can interact with the toolbars just like you do with a Win32 application. You can interact with the pull-down menus just like a Win32. And you can interact with the various components on the surface of the window, including data windows themselves. So the application seems to work just as well in the web browser as it does in a Win32 or 164 mode. I'll exit at this point. So the next question, where does my PowerServer web mobile application reside once I actually deploy it? For this, let's have a look at File Manager. If we go to File Manager, you'll notice on the C drive for IIS we have inetpub and then wwroot. Double-clicking that, if we go down a little bit further, you'll notice that the sales application has been installed under wwroot. If I double-click on that, you can see here that your PowerBuilder PowerScript has been converted to JavaScript, and then HTML files and XML files have been generated as well as if you have web services, WSDL handle in here. The plugins, of course, for OLE, OCX, DLLs are here as well. And the metadata to actually run your application. The images that you map to your database configuration, all of that is actually then in the subfolders and the files that have been loaded into the sales folder. So when you execute the application, of course, it executes the default HTML page, which then actually runs the actual load on the JavaScript, which your PowerScript has been converted to, and then executes the application just as if it was compiled into a native executable. So that's where the actual application resides. It resides within PowerServer, which is running as a helper to the main application server, which in this case is the .NET IIS. Returning back here to the actual PowerBuilder IDE, if I select the Run here at this point, and I select, for example, the mobile device, it comes up with a QR code. And this is basically how to install the application or map to that application in PowerServer from the mobile device. But that also assumes that you have Appeon Workspace installed on the mobile device. So we'll be actually testing the sales application and showing you how to do that from the mobile device in the next video called Configuring Appeon Workspace. So congratulations, you now successfully built a PowerServer web and mobile project configuration, and you've actually been able to deploy that to PowerServer and run the web side of the sanity test on the sales application. Thanks for watching.